Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me first open by thanking Gareth for the invitation to be here, thanking Sarah and everyone else involved with putting together this extraordinary event. I'm Bruno Carvalho. I'm a professor here at Harvard, where, among other things, I just finished a book I've been working on for a long time that's a history of how people imagined the future of urbanization and urban landscapes from the 1800s onward. So even though I'm not a landscape person proper, I am very much at home on a panel titled Futurities. And I'm very much looking forward to learning from the exceptional panelists today. So this panel really brings together an extraordinary array and concentration of different kinds of knowledge, including practical and institutional. I will very, very briefly introduce each of the speakers. This session will have a bit more of a conversational mode to it. So each will speak for about 5 minutes with remarks positioning their thoughts on the challenges and future of landscape architecture in the global south. We will then very quickly turn to questions and discussion. I'll do brief introductions. They'll come to the stage. They'll speak. I will turn to you. So please keep note of your questions. We will get to them. So first, we will hear from Jala Makhzoumi, who's the acting president for IFLA Middle East, and she's an adjunct professor at the American University of Beirut and a co-founder of Unit 44, a consultancy in ecological planning and landscape architecture. And Jala is the 2021 laureate of the IFLA Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe Award for her outstanding contribution to education and practice in landscape architecture. After that, we will hear from Graham Young, who has 40 years of experience consulting and teaching landscape architecture in South Africa and across the continent. And he's received many industry awards and is currently the president of IFLA Africa region and is a past vice president of IFLA World. Next, we will hear from Tosin Oshinowo, who is now one of our own as a Loeb Fellow at the GSD, but is also a Lagos-based architect and designer renowned for her expansive residential and commercial spaces and insights into socially responsive approaches to urbanism. And we will see some of her work showcased at the 19th Venice Architecture Biennale later this year. Next, we will hear from also Harvard's Jungyoon Kim, who's an assistant professor in practice of landscape architecture at the GSD and is the founding principal of Park Kim, a Seoul and Boston-based landscape architectural firm practicing beyond the conventional boundary of the profession. And then, more strictly from outside the boundary of the profession, we are lucky to have Adewale Owoseni, who is a scholar in the fields of African philosophy and environmental humanities and is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard's Mahindra Humanities Center, which I had the good fortune of directing when his selection was made. And Adewale is a faculty member at the University of Ibadan, where he also teaches courses on philosophy. So please join us on stage. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hello, everyone. Yes, it's good. Yeah, thank you. And gosh, it's daunting to be the first to speak. Okay, so I'm IFLA president for IFLA Middle East, and I'm initially from Iraq. I was born in Iraq, and I've practiced in Lebanon, so more or less in the region. And Middle East is really a minuscule region compared to Africa. So it's tiny, but a lot of the challenges are very similar. There are also many commonalities between Africa and the Middle East. Ecological continuities, cultural links that go back in history. Also a colonial history in both territories where the land was divided, territories were divided into nation states. And a lot of the problems in the Middle East derive from that. At the same time, the capital cities, which, as we have seen from the talks today, again, there are a lot of challenges in capital cities because everybody is coming to the capital city and the rural peripheries are undermined and depleted. And like Carrie spoke a little earlier, the profession is new to the Middle East. And there are really two sets of challenges. They are both big. But the first set of challenges are to do with establishing the profession. There are only three countries in what is IFLA Middle East, Iran, where the education, landscape architecture education is well established, in Lebanon, and in Saudi, which offered the first degree in '75. There's only 4 associations, so International Federation of Landscape Architects, certified associations within the countries of the Middle East. So really, it's very small, and there are very big challenges. So the first challenge is really education, how to establish programs to teach landscape architecture. And I think there was a debate earlier about masters within a department of architecture, MLA. So that, I think, works because architecture is a very well-established profession in the region. And there's almost a department of architecture in every country, if not more than one. So that is one way to do it. But that is really a very big challenge, and we're working on that. Equally challenging is that there's just a handful of professionals. And again, something Carrie said resonates a lot with the Middle East, namely that it's not just landscape architects. There's people practicing landscape who are not architects, who are horticulturists, they're in agriculture, or they are architects or urban designers. So when we established the Lebanese Landscape Association in 2016, that was ratified by IFLA, we did not call it, the name of the association was the Lebanese Landscape Association, LELA. We intentionally used association to be inclusive of all of those professions. So this is a challenge. And the International Federation of Landscape Architects provides an incredible umbrella, international umbrella, for credibility, which is really, really needed and important. So this is really one set of challenges which are more practical, and they are big, but to me, the bigger challenge lies in the word landscape. There is a problem there, at least in the Middle East. Landscape is translated in Arabic dictionaries as mandar tabi'i, natural scenery, which is an outdated definition of landscape. And it is very problematic for 2 reasons. First of all, because it originated in a Western culture, in North European culture. Second, because it is anthropocentric, a scene, looking at a scene, when you say landscape is scenery, it's centered on the people, it's dominating of the environment, and landscape is not at all that. Landscape is really a way of, as we have seen in those amazing talks yesterday and today, landscape is a way of beholding that is inclusive of nature and culture, of people and environment, and that is the most important thing about landscape is it is anchored, it is situated, it is contextualized, and for that reason, it in turn contextualizes. So using a landscape framing, so it's not so much landscape architecture, but landscape framing helps us root whatever we are looking at, whether we are reading a situation or whether we are trying to find solutions in the context applying landscape to post-war recovery. When we talked about that, people were laughing. I mean, they've lost their houses, you're going to make gardens for them? But that's not, and in the end, they saw that it was very different because we did not look to building, to reconstruction. Recovery is about people and about their environment and what they have, their dignity, their pride, and restoring all of these. So all of this is embedded in landscape, but what do we do with the word? So this is really one of the key challenges that we have. Earlier in this session, Senshaba spoke something. He said, I'm not in landscape, I'm an architect. I'm interested in land. Land, on the other hand, if you drop the scape and keep the land is very clear in all cultures, in all languages, and has no baggage. And it's the first time it hit me that land is something. But anyway, that's a very big debate. But this is part of, and I really think, from my point of view, that a lot of the speakers' amazing achievements and speakers today and yesterday, underlying their arguments is really this issue. Wanting to free ourselves from the constraints of a Western approach to landscape. And the problem, again, with the Middle East and a lot of the Global South is that we're 30 years behind in everything, even in the conception of landscape. Conception of landscape has changed abroad, but in our part of the world, it is very old. So that, and again, Carrie said, if you ask what is a landscape architect, they say, we don't know. That I accept if they don't know, because it gives me a chance to explain. Worse is when they say, oh, you do beautification, you add trees to sides to make them beautiful. So to overcome all of these is really a very big challenge. And a final point I wanted to make is that I don't think landscape is the domain of landscape architects. I really think, and it's very clear from the speakers that have been assembled in this conference, landscape, as I said, is a way of beholding. It's a way of reading the context and responding to it. And in that, on the contrary, the more people we have coming into this discipline, the multiplicity of views and ways of looking with their expertise could really take landscape in a very, very different direction than the one where it is currently. I think these are mainly the points that I wanted to make. Thank you.
Right, well, thanks. I just want to also thank Gareth and the GSD for inviting us here. And I think by way of thanks, I just want to share a little anecdote with you. Yesterday we heard that Johan van Papendorp had been here 50 years ago and graduated from the GSD in 1975. Well, I was also here 50 years ago. I was a student at the University of Toronto, and myself and two of my mates got in a car and drove all the way down to the GSD to see this new building that everyone was talking about, this new studio. And Johan might have been in that studio at the time. I don't know. We didn't know each other at the time. And we were also down here to see some of the projects that were going on in Boston at the time. And both of us went back to Toronto. I was still studying there. Johan went back there to work. And then at the end of the 70s and into the early 80s, we both ended up back in South Africa and have been colleagues ever since. So, Gareth, thank you. It's full circle. We're both at the end of our careers, I think, although we still try to work hard and make a living. But it's really nice to be back here, and thanks so much for that. All right, on with my little talk here. So I'm going to talk about the future of landscape architecture in Africa. So I'm going to contextualize that also in the idea of the sublime and the pragmatic. We've been hearing a lot about this in the last couple of days. And the future of landscape architecture in Africa is poised at the intersection, I think, of these two ideas. The sublime, the vast, awe-inspiring landscapes we have that are shaped by deep cultural indigenous knowledge systems and ecological narratives, and the pragmatic, which demands a practical approach to sustainable, adaptive, and socially responsive solutions. This dynamic tension will shape how landscape architecture evolves in response to the significant issues that we face in Africa, generally speaking. But I believe that the future of landscape architecture in Africa is mainly positive and shows strong growth for potential. So I'll just take you through some of those ideas now and then get to the challenges. First of all, the rapid urbanization is driving demand for projects typically associated with landscape architecture. Africa, as we've heard, is one of the fastest urbanization rates in the world, with cities like Lagos, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa expanding exponentially. And this demands, of course, requires green infrastructural responses, sustainable urban planning, and public spaces, which obviously create more opportunity for landscape architects. So there's definitely growth potential there. Second point is climate change is forcing landscape solutions. Again, we've heard a lot about that. In Africa, again, we've heard, is one of the most vulnerable continents with regards to climate change. We face extreme droughts, floods, desertification, and land degradation is the primary result of all of this. Governments and developers and NGOs are increasingly beginning to invest in sustainable landscape solutions, like, for instance, the Green Wall, the Sahel region in northern Nigeria, right across to Africa there. Flood mitigating projects like in Dar es Salaam, the Mzimbazi River Project in Dar es Salaam, which has been promoted by the government, the president actually, and in Lagos there's all sorts of initiatives to deal with flood mitigation and coastal restoration on the western east coast of Africa, using mangroves as the primary way of dealing with it. So there is, again, an urgent need for these approaching with these things and dealing with these issues, and nature-based solutions comes to mind. Then there's the rise of green and smart cities. Believe it or not, countries like Rwanda, who are basically leading the way in that. Kenya and South Africa are also promoting eco-friendly, innovative city models. Like Kigali's Green Pilot Project, Nairobi's Karura Forest Regeneration, and in South Africa we have smart cities. One of them is Lenceria Smart City, which envisages South Africa's first city built around a major airport. And in Cape Town, they also have a smart city initiative that revolves around traffic management, water conservation, and renewable energy initiatives. So this growth also gives a potential to landscape architects, where governments are beginning to embed the idea of landscape architecture into dealing with some of these problems. Then we have strengthening of landscape architectural education. We had a lovely session a few minutes ago about this and what it should be and how we should be going about it. And there are more universities are introducing landscape architecture programs, particularly Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. And in over 20 years, though, in South Africa, it took the organization like the Institute of Southern African Landscape Architects pushing for greater recognition and regulation, again, something we also heard about just now, which ultimately culminated in the Landscape Architecture Act, which promotes and recognizes the industry in South Africa. But it's the only African country where it is officially recognized. So that's a debate and discussion. Is it worth it? Do we not have it? How does it work in our part of the world? And so, of course, the growth potential here is as professionals are trained, the industry hopefully would mature and expand. Then we have an increased investment in tourism and conservation. Africa is one of the tourist destinations in this regard. And projects like the Serengeti National Park upgrades, Mapungubwe Interpretation Center. By the way, that interpretation center won the Architecture of the Year Award about 2 or 3 years ago. Amazing little building. Peace Parks Foundation, which was an initiative founded by Nelson Mandela and others, is mandated to rewild Southern Africa's Southern Africa and the Peace Park's early successes included creating 10 transfrontier conservation areas, which protected millions of hectares of land. And of course, there's a potential for growth here in our industry as we would become involved with this ecotourism industry. And then finally, in terms of growth and the potential, we've got the importance of cultural heritage projects in fostering national identity. Again, something we heard about just now, where the integration of indigenous knowledge, Africans' rich heritage of traditional land management practices provides a unique foundation for sustainable design. Cultural heritage projects are crucial for African countries as they serve multiple functions, including preserving history, fostering national identity, and promoting healing from past traumas. These memorials are not just physical structures. They embody collective memory, or can if they're designed correctly, resilience, and the notion of storytelling, which is such an African skill. So there are many examples of these kinds of projects across Africa. One of them in my part of the world, Freedom Park, which educates visitors on South Africa's struggle against apartheid through indigenous storytelling and symbolic features, and the whole concept for that was driven very strongly by indigenous knowledge systems. And there was a year of consultation with different groups where we just listened to people to find out what their perception or conception would be of a memorial that would, and we had huge objectives for it. Not only should it be a memorial, but it must be a place of truth and reconciliation and healing. And whether it's met those or not is up for debate. Of course, the challenges are typical. I'm not going to go through those. We've heard about them, yeah. So I'm just going to end then by stating then, in short, that I believe in the short term, yes, landscape architecture is going to experience steady growth in Africa. As we deal with these opportunities that come up. In the long term, 20 to 30 years down the line, there's actually potential for exponential growth, but a whole bunch of things need to be in line there. And unfortunately, they're not so much. And I extracted a couple of thoughts from yesterday's session, which resonated with me regarding where we're going and what we're doing. And someone asked somewhere along the line, how can Africans teach the world? Good question. Diversity equals strength. Someone said breaking definitions is key. Like that one. Respect, work respectfully. I think, Gareth, I think you said that. And then there was another thing about respect. Respect what there is and keep learning. But it requires patience and listening. And then finally, from a colleague I was talking to from South America just before this conference, he said, you know, in Africa you have unimaginable cultural reserve. His words. So the future of landscape architecture in Africa is indeed positive. The combination of urban expansion, the need for climate adaptation, and the integration of indigenous practice creates a fertile environment for the discipline to flourish. However, while there are tremendous potential for growth, there are challenges. The most compelling African landscape architecture will balance these two forces, the sublime and the pragmatic. As the field grows, the future will belong to the designers who can merge poetic and awe-inspiring landscapes with solutions that address Africa's urgent environmental challenges. The sublime will inspire, and the pragmatic will sustain. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Is it on? Okay. Thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here. Following Graham, I have to say I don't necessarily agree with everything that you said, and I'm just going to speak from my lived experience. I am an architect practicing in Lagos. And when this invitation came up, I had to quickly check and find out, do we have an institute for landscape architects? And I was told that we do. It's in its infancy. It's about 3 years old. I do not know if they actually train architects at university to be landscape architects yet. But we do have a a big challenge in Nigeria, and I will speak specifically of Lagos where I practice, in there not being a great understanding of how important landscape is. Usually on building projects, there are two things that get cut in terms of budget. At the end of a project, when you're getting really stressed about costs, is painting and landscape. Those are the first things that go out. And we are urbanizing so urgently, and you see newer parts of the city with absolutely no level of green at all. New areas of the city are being developed as concrete havens. And these are big contemporary structures that have absolutely no soft landscaping. Everything's hard landscaping. We had a big problem in 2023 and 2024 during the Harmattan season, which is the dry season, where we had massive heat waves. And all of a sudden, people are realizing that we don't have any landscape. We have older parts of the city that they are cutting down 100-year-old trees because they are widening roads. And the Lagos State Parks Authority, last park, are at the foreground of actually chopping all these trees down. And it makes you wonder, what is going wrong? We have the continent has so many cultures that have always worked in harmony and respect of the environment, of the landscape. But why is it in modernity we have completely negated this? It's such a worrying reality. It causes problems to do with flooding when you don't have groundwater retention because the soil isn't being held. We have issues of carbon capture. We have issues of shading and keeping areas cool. And this is happening right in front of us. I live in an estate where my neighbor is telling me that she needs to cut my tree down. And I'm like, she said, oh, the roots are disturbing her fence. I'm like, just cut the roots, just going to your fence. Why'd you have to cut my tree? You know, there isn't a respect for green. And I think this is something that needs to be addressed. We need to find ways of putting within policy that within any development, you know, we have suggestions right now in planning in Lagos, which in Nigeria, that says whatever your building, your land footprint is, 40% should be built and the rest should be soft. But they don't actually say that it should be soft landscaping or hard landscaping. So people just make everything hard. But there needs to be ways that policy is put into place to ensure that this is imbibed. Because sadly, what's very clear to me is that the culture of understanding the fact that we are supposed to be in balance with the environment, unfortunately, in modernity is, at least from my experience, has been gone. Thank you.
Is it on? Okay. I am neither an African nor having worked in the continent. So you should blame Gareth for having me here, just to begin with. But I think I would have not dared to just accept his invitation if I didn't have this fortune to visit Africa last January for the first time in my life. Not that I know much about the region after that very short visit, but what I'm saying today will be really based on my shallow knowledge in Africa, about Africa, and also the Rwanda I went to. And also relate to my ongoing research about how landscape architecture as a modern profession started in Asia, Korea, Japan, and China, Singapore, and Thailand, which was the topic of my seminar for the last 2 years. And then how such onset has shaped how Asian landscape architects has been practicing in contemporary society. So what I just brought some keywords that where I just thought that the future of African landscape architecture could be found. But those are anything but advice or suggestion, but nothing but something I wish Asian landscape architecture has been developed in such a way. So the first one is about how the future profession of landscape architecture in Africa could actually position themselves. So I really think that they should be positioning themselves as a kind of leader of infrastructure level projects. So speaking of Korea's 60s and 70s, it was like a huge era of construction. So it was right after the Korean War, where when the 90% of Korean peninsula was burned. And the topographic condition of Korea is very similar to Rwanda. It's actually filled with mountains. So for the construction of like all different type of railways and road construction, the mountains had to be like cut and severely destroyed. So after the President Chung-il Park came back from his literally loan bagging trip to Germany, he decided to create this profession of landscape architecture as a greening profession that could actually cover up all those construction surfaces of mountains. And then the first landscape department was actually founded in 1973 in Seoul National University, where I went to. But there's always like pros and cons. The profession was started by such a strong governmental power, but because it was started as a greening profession, still the public awareness of landscape architecture is not really in the level of how I wish it to be. For example, I sometimes need to still explain that I am doing something other than planting trees, right? And then on the other hand, like in the 70s and 60s, it's all about growth and economic prosperity. So the notion of green infrastructure, blue infrastructure, of course, was not there. So now Korea really, and also other developed Asian countries are really trying hard how we can actually adapt to this climate change in the national infrastructure level. So I think that's where this African landscape architecture profession has huge potential. So I learned it when I was in Rwanda, that the Rwandan government trying to construct the first railway connect to Tanzania, which would eventually give the nation coastal accessibility to this landlocked country. So I think that's kind of project that is exactly the future landscape profession need to really lead in the infrastructure level, so that the country's infrastructure could actually start as green infrastructure rather than add anything afterwards. And then I saw already something going on in Rwanda when I visited. So Ellen DeGeneres' campus of Diane Fossey Gorilla Fund that was presented yesterday. And I saw this series of wetlands that are covering a vast amount of the land that are really treating a big amount of gray water and black water without infrastructural, the sewer. So that could be scaled, if that could be scaled up in national level, I think that's a really groundbreaking practice of landscape architecture. Second point I brought is how African landscape architecture could actually go beyond exoticness and then becoming a globally applicable body of knowledge. So this is something that Asian landscape architecture also kind of struggles. We have kind of this identity problem. So before the Western colonizing power arrived in the region, none of the Asian native languages had this term describing the region like Asian or Asia. So the term Asian itself kind of gives all of us this misconception that the identity of 51 countries can be explained by one term, which is not really possible. I think in case of Africa, one of the key is how you could materialize your spirituality. I think this is kind of brought up yesterday also, and it is really similar to what Graham just mentioned, sublime and pragmatic together. For example, like the facade of the house built by the woman that presented in Anne's presentation yesterday, it was just beautiful enough, like as beautiful as Mark Rothko's painting, just by looking at that texture and color without knowing all this spiritual context of the region and context. So how could this production of African landscape architecture could appeal to the outside of the continent, even for people who are really ignorant about the culture? So I think that could really be next assignment for the future landscape architect in Africa. And I think this is also what Thabo mentioned in the morning, locally informed adaptation. So it's really based on the locality, but really, and also it's also breaking the boundary of the local and science. And I think I saw this already happening also in Rwanda. I'm sorry, this is the only country I've been to in Africa. So in RICA, which stands for Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture, I saw these beautiful earth walls that are really minimize the use of concrete, but then just taking advantage of the local soil that was excavated from the site, which is perfect solution for this landlocked country. And I think, for example, like the whole procedure of conception of such a wall until the realization, I think this itself could become a body of knowledge, could be applicable in other part of the world who really needs this kind of strategy of the sourcing material locally and built with less costs and utilizing all this local knowledge that I really already present. And by this way, I think African landscape architecture could be beyond exaltingness and really becoming global knowledge. Lastly is about education. So at the beginning of Asian landscape architecture, the influence of Western educated professional has been really huge. And it's still so. So there are many landscape and architecture forums that are founded and run by Western educated people like my firm. So, for example, like 3 of 5 professors in my college were educated in UPenn. And they're actually conditionally appointed to the professorship with their, so they had to study abroad to continue to be professor in Seoul National University because, you know, someone had to be teach when there's actually no MLA graduate at the time in 1973. But then now there are some concern that raised by the critics of architecture and landscape architecture. It's about homogenization of the spatial design in Korea and also other Asian countries. That is any architecture and landscape product are actually really based on their own culture. I mean, do they have to? But that's, I don't know, that's different set of discussion. But I think this risk of homogenization in African landscape architecture can be mitigated by pedagogies that are discussed this morning also. And for example, the fostering professionals into the leadership of the infrastructure level design and working with really a profound understanding of the locality, both in spiritual and practical and materialistic dimension, with territorial thinking and also engineering literacy. So I think in that way, landscape architecture profession in Africa could be really the alternative future for the field, not just African field, but global field in the era of climate change. Well, thank you.
Greetings, everyone. I must begin on a lighter note. I really wonder what I'm doing here. I think just like most philosophical thought, I oftentimes agree to be like footnote after Plato's work. My talks will be like just footnotes to yours. Because most of my job is done. I should just take my leave and... Well, I would just like to make maybe a few comments and then illustrate my point through an event in 2019 that happened. Don't worry. I know that some of us relate with the so-called Twitter generation, so perhaps you might know about this event. So talking about the future of African landscape, from what you just said now and what Jala said earlier on, it gave me a clearer view of what landscape is not. By the way, don't mind my philosophical twist to this. I'm not in the field. I don't know what happens there. So I'm just going to speculate. It gives me an idea of what landscape is not. And it also gives me an impression of what landscape architecture as a field or an academic discipline is. And these are two different tensions that one really needs to unpack. And it gives me an idea of two scales of understanding the whole idea of the future of African landscapes. One may want to ask, which Africa are we talking about? She talks about the question of homogeneous impression about Africa, doing the pedagogical way. I agree with that. But you might want to raise the question of, are we talking about African landscapes in the world? Or are we talking about African landscape and worldscapes? So it brings forward the question of, are we addressing this just from a closed-door approach of looking at African landscape as it is locked up in the peculiarities of African cultural context or ecological context? Or are we bringing it up within the context of the world entanglement of ecological crisis? So, and I think this is what your talk has really, clarified for me. I wasn't thinking about that direction before, but you've given me something to chew, and thank you for that. In 2019, a man from Uganda by the name, can you guys hear me? Yes. All right, a man from Uganda by the name Milton Halimadi visited River Thames in London. And he took a picture with the river at the background. And then he declared and proclaimed, "Wow, I discovered a river. I don't know what the natives calls it, but I've given it a proper name. And I've renamed it River Guli." You would know that Guli is a city in northern part or region of Uganda. And there were mixed reactions to this proclamation. So many people were on the side of Sir Milton, if I can call him that, that he should be knighted and be added to the list of colonial explorers or discoverers. Just the same way you have the word of Sir Livingstone, Sir Samuel Baker, Mungo Park, and the rest of them. But some people were like, no, this brings up or echo the whole issue about the trauma that comes with colonial discovery of African landscape. And it became a question of what is the logic behind colonial discovery of landscape. And there were two, maybe that I think of that one can actually engage with. One can think about it from the politics, identity politics you mentioned, the identity politics of dispossession of African agency regarding landscapes. And one can also think about it from the repossession of African agency through landscape. And that is why we have the context of indigeneity as a criterion of decoloniality. Earlier on, Professor Adejuma was making this clear distinction between decolonization and decoloniality. It was intriguing for me because I agree with you, sir, that indeed the ceremony held that most African nations were independent. But structurally and infrastructurally, African states are not independent, which makes, the whole idea of decoloniality a kind of almost the same thing as the process of decolonization, because the vestige of colonial legacy still remains there. I mean, to date, we are replicating in post-colonial African states, we are replicating the reproduction of the English law of land administration through the land use or land tenure as we have it. And the question of decolonization, confronts me like, so how do we decolonize? Which is also a pedagogical question. And I would go the African philosophy way because that's my safe haven of engagement with issue, and I will follow the Ghanaian African philosopher Kwasi Wiredu, who talks about conceptual decolonization. And when he talks about conceptual decolonization, he's talking about two streams of critical engagement with African experience, African concept of landscape, and so on and so forth. He's saying there's need for some kind of upstream engagement whereby we begin to re-examine and reappraise on critical assimilation of Western strategies. And it doesn't mean to totally put out the baby with the bathwater. What he's saying is that those part of colonial vestige of strategies of engagement with our landscapes or with our cultural identities that are not progressive should be shredded. Those that could actually expand Africa within the global space of relevance should be adopted or adapted. That's the word you used, sir, in the morning, adaptability. And of course, it talked about the downstreams of it, where he also said there is also need to look inwards. Is it in all cases that our African cultural practices and performative agencies are progressive? We need to ask ourselves those questions. And I think I would like to stop here and say conceptual decolonization is the way, because it actually emphasizes the idea of collaborative agency from within and without of the African space. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank each of you and thank all of you. This was tremendous. First, let me get some sense of how many hands we have there of questions, comments. Okay. I don't see many, so I will take my prerogative as moderator and do two things. The first thing I want to do is open a space for you to respond and react to each other. The second is ask a question which I would also like you to react to. And then when we turn to all of you, we'll do 2 and 2 to give you the possibility of ignoring any questions you wish to. I'm on your side. But you can go to them afterwards too and make them answer. So I want to go back to the title of this panel, Future and Futurities, and ask you to name a tension that is explicit in some of the talks, latent in others, but sort of hovers through the discussion, which is the tension between the future is something to be built and the future is something to be averted or avoided. Either institutional instabilities that we haven't quite put our fingers on, but are very much shaping this and any encounter at this moment, but also very concrete challenges of landscapes to which we might not have the tools to address. And some were very explicitly named, climate and water and so on. Tosin made me think of one more concrete to introduce a hook to the philosophical twist, which is when you mentioned 100-year-old trees being cut for widening roads. If you think of how a century ago or so, and in subsequent decades, landscape architects, designers, planners, imagined the future of land, the variable they most consistently missed was just how much surface area would be devoted to parking lots, to storing cars. So give you one sort of concrete future to be built for some, to be avoided for others, and ask you to respond to that tension in whatever terms you choose. So those are the two. Well, that one and then the other, just responding to each other as you wish and see fit.
Okay. So the first one was something
Tension
to be
between
built or?
the tension between the future something to be built and something to be avoided.
Yeah. I think neither, because the future is really, from the perspective of a landscape professional, it is how to mediate community. This is the way I see the role of how to mediate people, communities, their needs, with those that have the power and have the resources to help them. So this is, for me, so it's not about building. And I think the landscape architect is in a very good position to be a facilitator and a mediator, because they are more sensitive to ecology, to the land, to what's happening, and to listening, which was something that was said a lot, and that they can then serve to articulate with the community these ideas and then take them forward and follow them. So this is, to me, the role.
I think with regards to this idea of building, we have to build. People need places to live, and people need to get around, and so on and so forth. And when I'm thinking about this whole concept of professions and professionals in the built environment, what keeps coming back to me is no matter where we stand on the spectrum, we have lost our spirituality to a large degree. And arguably in the Western world, whatever that means these days, we've really gone way beyond understanding that kind of spirituality. And in the Western world, people are looking to other Eastern and African or whatever. But if we had that spirituality within us, then there would be a certain, and I think across the board again, there's a certain sensitivity which comes with your understanding of spirituality that would, towards your fellow human being and to nature. So where landscape architecture comes in this idea of building and in the future, it goes back to our heroes in the 60s, which were basically saying we should be looking at this problem as to where to build and where not to build. But we decided to just build anywhere because we could. If we need you go to the Middle East now and they're building, they're building residential areas in the sea. In the early days, we called land reclamation filling in a wetland. So I think where our skill as landscape architects, going now to the pragmatic aspect of it, is to understand that sensitivity, to regain that sensitivity if we don't have it. And with that comes our understanding of ecological and social approaches towards dealing with this idea of where to build or not to build, or where to build or where not to build. Thank you.
I agree with you. I really think it is a future to build. I think very early on in my career, I was dealing with the question of what an African building is, and the idea of what the typology or visually what it looked like. And everything that was African was of tradition, not of modern. The reality is that we don't live like that anymore. And so the lessons, the ideas, the landscaping, the balance with ecology that existed has gone a long time ago. The reality is we are all living in cities. 70% of the world will live in cities by 2050. And this is the reality of our future context. And we need to very intentionally build in systems and structures that better balance with ecology. And that's really where I think we need to go. I don't even think it's a situation of separating areas, but looking at ways of creating some kind of hybridized system that allows us to coexist, with landscape in a beautiful way and better in balance with the environment. I think that's ideally what I would say is a way to move forward.
Yeah, I think it's really great opening question by our moderator, and I think this is something that I wanted to, discuss further with Jala's comment about being a more inclusive umbrella. I totally agree to the idea of inclusive umbrella as a young, smaller profession, because I think for young and smaller profession which always have to work with this civil engineers and architects and all these other professionals to be able to build something. If we become defensive, I think we will lose many things. So I always try to open up my mind and really try to be kind of overseeing person. I think that's a kind of way that, like a small country to like Netherlands and Korea, we are all very small country, and then we just have to open up to be part of the global citizen rather than being defensive. So I think it's similar to landscape profession that we need to be more inclusive. But there's always like this danger for this young and vulnerable profession that we can be eaten by this giants around us always. Sometimes people think that they can do landscape Of course, there are many landscapes are actually designed and built by non-landscape architects. I don't disagree, but I think in that context, maybe we shouldn't distinguish something to be built and something to be avoided too much. Rather, I think we need to strengthen the core knowledge of the profession. For example, something that only we can do. For me, is about making terrain, like a topographic modification. I think that's what landscape architects do better than others. And I think that also the territorial thinking and ecological mindset is also something that is part of the core knowledge of profession. So I'd rather say that way. Yeah.
Yes. I consider that concepts are quite stubborn sometimes. They are very troublesome. When you say future, right, it comes with some pockets of questions also. Whose future? Who are the people building this future, and what for, right? But we might not always answer these questions, conclusively, but it's always an ongoing process. I would like to factor that when we talk about the future, we're talking about something that a condition that encompasses the past, learning from what has been done before, trying to engage it within present circumstance to see the possibilities of doing it better. And within the scope of ecological issues generally, when you say the future, oftentimes we have this sentiment for unborn generations, right? We're not living for the moment. We're living for the perpetuity of, continuity of life and all. So I would say that as it is, there are certain examples we can draw from what is going on, especially looking at it from the angle of indigenous ecologies, like what the priestess did with Oshinowo yesterday. Dialogue and negotiation is important. A collaborative, effort towards imagining a future whereby the place, the essential value or core values of a place or of a people are not going to be compromised, all in the name of globalization, all in the name of, development, all in the name of modernity that you mentioned the other time. I think if we have that, we can begin to envision some possibilities of a good future, a desirable future. And I think we can also learn from the different models of experiment that has been done in Kenya and all by trying to attribute sentiency to nature. Having the sense to understand that for whatever actions we take, there is a concomitant reaction or a consequence to that. So I think when we have such in our minds, then we think of a conceivable future.
Well, thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Ade, I want to direct this question to you. I've been thinking, and I don't want to bring up American politics because I don't know much about American politics, but, it struck me recently that when it looked as if America is going to turn its back on Europe in terms of, its NATO agreements and whatever, it sort of suddenly made me realize that, oh, snap, Europe has kind of been living in this comfort of having a very sort of discreet big brother with a big gun like this. And we kind of never really saw that until now. And suddenly now, they're talking about building up their own arms and stuff. And, when I think about what it means for us to have developed all the weapons that we developed of development, the weapons of mitigating risks and dangers in relation to the natural world and the universe, in terms of systems of predictability, things like everything that we have in modernity. Because I would imagine at some point nature was not really this benevolent being that, imagine being in a situation where you don't have water or, you know, where you're struck by famine or whatever the case may be. And so we are maybe right now having conversations like this because we are sort of still in the comfort and, you know, enjoying the benefits of, you know, modernization, just like that big gun. But maybe if it's removed, suddenly we'll be like, oh no, don't take me back. So the question for me really to you is, how do we, are we kind of really fooling ourselves into thinking that, you know, or have we forgotten and we're sort of, you know, enjoying this condition that we're in, and we can kind of sit here and imagine this future of nature, etc. I think you know where I'm going with this question.
I said that I was going to collect two, but let's turn it back.
Yes, that's quite a complex question, I must admit. But when we were talking, what came to my mind was the Gaia hypothesis. The Gaia hypothesis or something, yeah. The last man imagination. Like. So the question would be, would nature go on without humans? I don't know. Would nature go on without humans? Sure, it would recycle itself, right? So I think we just try to make sense of reality through our limited human conceptual schemes of understanding. And it's nothing wrong for me to want to desire to live a good life. You understand what I'm saying? I mean, technology is a way for me to enhance myself, to empower myself to survive, right? I don't want to think of the worst possibilities. If the words of the non-humans that we take for granted today, maybe the plants and trees, they develop some capacities beyond our capacity, what happens to us in the future? So I think it still keeps on going, I don't know how we can get out of this problem. It's a human problem, but it's also a beyond human problem. That's what I can say. That question is philosophical. I'm going to answer you philosophically.
Well, just this thing about human and nature, I mean, that's fundamentally the problem, because we always see it as a, you know, there's human and there's nature, but there isn't. We're all part of it. And I think that's where we're losing the plot, because most of us don't believe that. So, yeah.
I'd just like to contribute to that. We followed a landscape studio to Sydney, and we spent a bit of time, you know, traveling around the country. And what became very clear to us was that for the First Nation people of Australia, that they have a very different relationship to land. Whereas the system that has brought about capitalism and modernity is very much encroaching on land and being able to control and refine it. To the First Nation people of Australia, they have an understanding that they belong to the land. The land does not belong to them. And I think that that relationship, which is so prevalent in their culture, is almost what the rest of the world doesn't have. And I think some of the challenges that we face today are because we have imposed believing that we can continue to extract at our convenience for infinity, when in reality that's actually not possible.
Just to comment, to follow up on what Graham was saying, yeah, we are definitely part of nature, but we have the ability to conceptualize nature. So this is what sets us apart. And the other thing about nature not being this benevolent, wonderful thing is very much part of the mythology in the Middle East. The name for desert was Mot, M-O-T. And Mot in Arabic is death. So in a way, we are warding off nature because this desertification is the end of. So yeah, there are many, but working with people, I think, you learn a lot of this from communities, and it's very important to be able to to get that sensitivity from how people, communities, but not just traditional. I'm not just talking about traditional communities and traditional knowledge. That is amazing. But also the displaced and how they manage their places, and there was a lot of that. So I think, yes, we should really be careful when we talk about nature.
I was trying to figure out how to be succinct with this question because we're talking about the futures. And I decided to frame it from my own perspective. When I was in primary school in the 80s, we were told cities are bad. And I think the country had a situation where we had something called Rudi Mashambani, go back to the villages and all that so that you don't have. So I see it a lot lately, and a lot of my students, I always tell them, don't start with the problem with urbanization or urbanization Africa. Let's look at the opportunities. Now, from the perspective of landscape architect, and really thinking about an African situation where it's going to be urban, how do we begin to celebrate that and communicate that celebration that urban is an opportunity and this is the reality? And maybe I'll just give you a small hint. One of the things about it is the majority of the people migrating to the urban centers are poor. And I think Ed Glaze is the one who says it very well. Cities don't make people poor. Poor people come to cities to look for opportunity. And a lot of the times what they can consume is very small. So how do we think about that from a landscape perspective and from an Africa perspective?
We're definitely suspending the two-question thing.
Can I go ahead? Yeah, excellent. A good question, but it starts with the question for me of, we keep talking about African landscape or African this and that. What is African? You know, North Africa is very different from Southern Africa, from the Central Africa. You ask about an African building. I was involved with a project. We had a debate for months. What's the African building? And some people saw it as the traditional thing. And Wally Saroti, Dr. Wally Saroti, a colleague of mine, friend of mine in South Africa, said it's not about the form so much. It's about the concept. It's the idea. That makes it African. It doesn't have to be form-driven. So the same about cities. I think there's a disconnect. I wrote here when you talked about cutting the trees down. There's a disconnect when people come from rural areas into the city, that they don't relate to the city, primarily because they recently come from a rural area. Not all of them, and that's not the case across Africa. Again, we've got cities in Africa that are ancient, but there's a disconnect between the expectations of the city and where they come from. And in Southern Africa, South Africa, many people come to the cities, but they always keep their home in the rural environment. And that's where they feel comfortable, and that's where they respect the environment. They'd never cut a tree down there because it gives shade, or it gives fruit or medicine. But you come to the city, and this public realm that we talk about, that we design, all of a sudden becomes the dumping place for everything. So there's that massive disconnect. So to answer your question, how do we reverse that disconnect? How do we create places in our cities where people can feel comfortable? I was telling someone the story where I live in my neighborhood. It's on a ridge. There's a natural conservation area on the ridge. Most of the people living in the area where I'm are white. But just across the railway line, Sunnyside, dense, most of the people living there are poor and usually black. We developed a little park in our neighborhood called the Commons. That's a traditional little park, grasses and trees and benches, and everyone comes there from all these communities. We have the Crane Park, which is the natural environment, which is run by the Crane Park, Friends of the Crane Park. Now, Friends of the Crane Park are mostly white. So the people coming up from a Sunnyside want to go and perform their rituals in Crane Park. Now, all the whiteys get excited because, hey, there's noise in the park. We must stop it. Call the security guys. So they close the park down for 2 days. You know, so there's now another disconnect happening there. the whiteys seemingly respect nature and understand it and think that's a great place to maybe go and listen to the birds and whatever. Other people have more fundamental, let's call it that way, relationship with those places. And so, so this is the reality of Africa, of Southern Africa. I'll catch myself there because there's no such thing as Africa, by the way. Yeah, so, yeah, those are my thoughts. I hopefully have helped you there.
Maybe I can add something, because as I mentioned, you know, there's no such thing Asian landscape architecture also, like, but you can see I keep using this word Asian because it's so convenient, right? And I just cannot find any alternative term that describe the region without explaining like too long. But I think it's such a great provocative suggestion by Arthur. I mean, I think each urbanity of each city of Africa needs to be redefined by landscape architects within yourself. Then you suggest outwards. I think that's something that maybe landscape profession need to do in Africa. Because I don't think 54 countries shares any same urbanity, right? So.
Even within countries, we don't share the
right,
same.
exactly,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
I was just going to add that I always wondered why, when in traditional neighborhoods in Baghdad and in a lot of the villages, not the villages actually, in cities, when they sweep their house, they throw whatever they sweep into the street. And this is, again, part of vandalizing parks, because it is the government's, and the government is never them. So this is also something. It's partly because we were always occupied, and you know. So these are also issues that are very important that landscape architects have to deal with, because they're sweeping their dirt into the spaces that we create. So we have to be careful.
Hi. Thank you so much for this wonderful panel and discussion. I find it very... I was raised in Nairobi and I have family in Zambia, and it's impossible to talk about African landscapes in the broadest context, especially East and Southern, without talking about extraction and displacement. A railway in Rwanda is about cobalt in the Congo, and that is inherently a violent act. When we talk about landforming at a different scale, we can bring joy back to it. One thing I'm grateful for being raised in Kenya is there is an inherent garden culture. There's an inherent joy in the land, and each person, especially in the rural areas, as Arthur mentioned, has a connection to the land. And communities that aren't displaced or have had more time over generations can tend to treat it more sacredly. There's kind of each action of planting and moving earth is very important across cultures, but what do you envision for cities such as Lagos, Nairobi, where most people aren't from that place, and this kind of post-colonial identity? What do you envision joy in the landscape? What does it look like, and how do you believe that people can be landscape practitioners without defining it as a profession? Thank you.
Let them answer.
What's that?
Let them answer, then...
Oh, yeah, please.
Then
yeah. No, it's just getting ready for
Yeah, there's another question.
There's another? Maybe, should we cluster now questions?
Yes.
All right, let's do it so we can get as many as... So.
Okay, I'll go. I think that, well, thanks for your presentations, colleagues. I think if I'm thinking about African futurities, there is one sort of aspect that we should look at in terms of landscape architects' competences, and that's the political dimension. In that the role of the advocacy role of landscape architects, how do we plan and be strategic for it? I'll give a couple of examples. Johannesburg has a bus rapid transport system. Pretoria has one. Dar es Salaam has one. And I think Addis Ababa has got one. And in all of this, one would be hard-pressed to find the critical role that the landscape architects have played, which is linking transportation and landscape. So I'll stop there as a comment.
Yeah, that was on my
Okay.
list of questions.
Well, I think it's individually a question and a comment. We're talking about public sphere. We're talking about future here. What public realm do we want in Africa? What public realm do we want in Africa? It's because the public realm, the public sphere, that is private, that is public. We should understand the consciousness that the public realm that we have in the West, it was very consciously, the framework came. It is a transition from monarchy to republic. We don't have that transition. We have a transition from monarchy to another monarchy in Nigeria. It's a transition from the monarchy on a city-state to a monarchy by the Queen. And nothing has happened till tomorrow. And we're now talking about looking at public sphere. Which public sphere? For who? For the elites? So we must sit down, and if we are thinking about the future and the spaces within public sphere, whose public sphere? We must deliberately sit down and say, this is the framework of the public sphere we want, either by 2063 or by 2070, and this is what we will teach the students about our own public sphere, not the public sphere that transited from monarchy to republic, or ours from monarchy to another monarchy that have not gone anywhere. Thank you.
I think, yeah, there's lots on the table. Good luck.
I just want to buttress what's just been said, and also I think that ties back to your question, the idea of how to think about space for people who are coming into cities. I think the point that was made about ownership, I think, is very important. I had never really tied the two together. The fact is, when people live in cities, it's no man's land. We don't value it, we don't appreciate it, and so we abuse it. And I think that relationship with land has to be made more consciously personal. I think that's the first point. Now, doing that on a collective level, I think goes back to what has just been said about whose public space it is. I don't know how that should be done, but I think just consciously being aware of where the pinch points are is also a very valuable point. So I really take this more as an opportunity of learning and what to think about as a practitioner.
I think Tarna's presentation was exceptional because the public space that was shared, the way it was approached, trees, they didn't want trees because of safety, they wanted to see each other, working with communities. I think participatory work is very important to engage them so that, because a lot of the parks, municipal parks, are a top-down sort of delivering a product, which in the end are meaningless to the people. And anyway, they don't practice, they walk, they don't need parks. So they don't use the parks the way the parks are used in the West, let's say, at least in a lot of the Middle East. So working with the communities to craft this public space so that they are engaged and so that they own it. The ownership, the issue of ownership comes by working with the community. And I think Tarna's example was really, because it was extreme. When you look at the landscape, it doesn't look nice. It doesn't look, we're always also aware of the aesthetics of it. But there was really, but it was profound because it was exactly what the people wanted, and it was very successful in the end.
Yes, that's a very provocative question. Is a lot of not in there. I would like to say that I agree with your question about what kind of public sphere are we talking about. But I think that we really need to deal with the public philosophy that guides the existence of this public sphere. So she talks about the community. Well, that's also something very important. Where are these philosophy which they are like I would like call it the collective values that guides people's experience of their space, that actually should create a sense of the kind of the design of the space they want to find themselves living. And when I say design of the space, I'm speaking about so many things. Let me use the Nigerian emphasis of O, so that you know that the thing enter my body. So I'm using, I'm talking about, the whole big package of welfare schemes that guides the political economy of development generally. We're talking about public sphere. I mean, it's good to have parks and all, but then there are more pressing issues in certain places, maybe you will agree with me, in Africa that deals with even how people can access spaces. I mean, we are talking now about landscape. I mean, it's extensive to the extent of talking about the ecosystem of healthcare in Africa. I mean, all these are part of the things that should contribute to what we think about the public sphere. And now to look at it from the political direction, like Prof mentioned the other time, is it moving from one monarchy to another domesticated monarchy, which of course is also complemented by some kind of parliamentary system of government anyways, in the case of Nigeria. Do we think about regionalism? This has been tried over and over again, and there's still a lot of debate going to its failure, to defend its failure most times. Do we think about talking about democracy just in the name of democracy as it is practiced, for instance, in most African states? What we have is paper democracy. It's just nominal democracy. You understand what I mean? Because if we talk about the privileges, the rights, and these things that should actually mobilize the kind of participation you should get from each individual with the involvement of the state, the structures are not really there. So I think it is a difficult question, but I can be hopeful or optimistic that if we get the guiding philosophy of the kind of public sphere we want, when we can have a way forward.
Can I maybe also respond to Tunji and what is public space by explaining a story of after apartheid was abolished in South Africa in 1994, we were in a very privileged situation that everything was up for grabs. You could question anything and everything, and we came up with what we think is the world's best constitution right now and various things like that. And the new government was aware that perhaps in the so-called township areas where poor people used to live, there were major open spaces. There were parks that had been set aside by the town planners. And it came to our attention that through the mayor's office that they wanted to start building parks in Soweto. So we went to the community, we started engaging with them, and they didn't want parks. They didn't want open spaces for two reasons. One, because the government said we're going to give you houses. And number two, because the open spaces were not safe. And actually a third one, there was a political agenda to these spaces. Oh, the poor people, let's give them a park, and they'll give them a park with no, in the past. So we had a long discussion with the community backwards and forwards. And our role then, coming back to the pragmatic, what do we do as landscape architects, is to present visions of the future. Whether they get built or not doesn't matter in many ways, but it shows what the potential can be. And those visions are tested against the people living in those areas. So that's what we did. We went backwards and forwards, backwards. And eventually, the one big thing that came to us, well, there were two things. One was the area that we were looking to develop was around an old dam, which had silted up. We want our dam back, they said. We want our dam back. So the pragmatic was, how do we get them the dam back and so that it doesn't silt up again? So there was all sorts of stormwater management systems that were put in place, including putting reed beds, which they hated because the reeds were where the scalums, even the snake you talk about in Soweto came up there too. So we had to explain from our perspective why reeds were important in this whole process. So we know the dialogue is now going. The other aspect which was very fortunate was in order to capture the water, slow it down and basically drop the silt out, because a lot of the houses in the Soweto area were not grassed, so there was a lot of wash from these places. It ended up in the stormwater catchment dams, which we left as grassed areas, and they just became open fields where their cattle were because they brought the cattle and goats into the city often, so they were grazing there. So the open space now is fulfilling a rural, perhaps what you would have thought of as a rural thing, as well as growing vegetables and all sorts of stuff. And the park around the dam became a very traditional park. You'd find it in Norway and Asia, or not Asia, Korea. So that worked, but it was a long process to determine what was the public space and what value that public space had to that particular community. Talking about ownership, I'm going on a little bit, but another technique we used was to engage, especially the women in the area. There was a whole, in the tender documents, there's a whole budget for training women in some form of art form. And it ended up being mosaic, not unlike what they were doing in the Cape. But also what we insisted, the lady that was helping us with us said, we must also teach these women how to run a bank account. Because what happens is often the woman would come home with the money, the guys would take the money, and they'd never see it again. And so there was a very practical lesson there, and they gained a skill which they then sold economically. So I think that's how it must work. And it takes a long time, and it's a long process, but you will get, and it doesn't matter where this park is, Korea, China, Russia, whatever. It's the same process that you go through of engagement and response to the landscape that you're dealing with when you come up with the design solutions.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I had a question. Sorry. Okay. A question, and again, more probably a comment than a question. As you discussed the sort of the whole. Oh, sorry. As you discussed the whole idea of landscape futurities. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. I was just wondering, I go to architecture conferences also, and it's always about how do we solve a problem. And sometimes when it gets to this point in the conversation, I feel like, well, maybe you're putting the cart before the horse, because the gentlemen, several people have mentioned, there's a structural problem in the societies of the world that got us to the point that you have a park where, on one side of the park, there's a white community, and on the other side, there's the black community. Well, the blacks don't necessarily want to be on the other side, but they have been denied the possibility of gaining the income that would allow them to buy the houses to get to that other side. And I think, you know, this gentleman talked about the public realm. I think the public realm is very important. Everyone wants a public realm, but they also want, you know, food on their tables to feed their children and just basic issues. And I guess I'm talking right now as from the architecture conference point of view, which I think it relates somewhat to what you're saying, because I go to these architecture conferences and it's all about how do we solve the problem? How do we make this better, that better? And I'm thinking, well, you know, if someone could afford the mortgage in a house in that area, they would take care of it just as well as the people that are afforded that mortgage income take care of it. So, and I guess I'm looking for balance here. You know, is there some issues in the world, and maybe the design profession cannot design our way out of those issues, but, you know, how do you help? And I'm thinking, someone mentioned about a railroad somewhere, and I'm thinking, yes, you know, how do you look at city design to sort of design it for more equitable distribution of, you know, jobs, houses, and everything, retail. And you mentioned, you know, the cities are the future. Are they? It's a question. You know, I love cities, but, you know, cities, the cities that were really nice are not necessarily where we're going to, you know, where cities are going to that I've seen in the last, that have come up in the last 20, 30 years. So, you know, what is that solution? I guess that was the question. What is that solution? I'm sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you. I mean, my question is inspired by Charles's question earlier about communication, and also Jala's comment about the naming of the Lebanese Landscape Association and the lack of an adequate word for landscape in Arabic. And we see with the Tunisian Association of Landscape Architects, for example, when you translate their title into English, it's engineers specialized in designing green spaces. The Egyptian Association gave up trying to translate landscape, and they just write landscape in Arabic. Yeah. And given that there are over 3,000 languages in Africa, I hear from some professors that they're teaching students about landscape architecture, and they don't have landscape in their language that they speak at home. And this causes confusion. So I'm wondering if you can describe the work of the landscape architect without using landscape or architect.
And this will be our last round.
And this will be our last, yeah. Then we'll take a short break.
That's a hard question.
Well, you're the perfect person to start with.
Yeah, I'll give it a go. Yeah, it's a difficult question. I mean, again, we go back. They use environment, and environment is not landscape. This is why for the first time, it hit me. I thought about it before. Land is very good, because land really, as I said, it has none of the colonial connotations or Western. Doesn't have the baggage. And for architecture, I don't mind the architecture, not because I am initially an architect, but because it's how you look at architecture. Architecture is not about buildings. Architecture is putting together something. This is how I see architecture. And if that is it, then it is okay to add the architecture to the landscape, because it is, yeah, I go back to the lady that said it is about design and problem solving. And you know, Gareth, that there was a fight in the UK because it was the Royal Institute of British Architects which changed its name to the Landscape Institute. Precisely, oh, sorry. Precisely to be more inclusive and to avoid the word architecture. But in the global south, which we're focusing on, we have to accept that architecture is a very well-established profession. And unfortunately, when you add architecture to landscape, landscape is incomprehensible, but the architecture is. So when you put them together, it sort of boosts where we are. So this is one way that I would look at it. So I would keep it, and I think it sounds very good. عمارة الأرض, architecture of the. عمارة is يعني it is the Arabic word for architecture, and it works very well. And it resonates well with all the challenges and problems that I've thought of. So.
Yeah, I think scape is the problem. Because it's derived from picturesque understanding, a beautification, a idealistic setting. So let's get rid of scape and just call ourselves land architects. I agree exactly. Architecture not in terms of building architecture, but architecture as a concept of putting things together, absolutely. Whether it's buildings or the land, not the landscape, the land, or a product, a chair or whatever. It's all a form of architecture. It's all putting things together. So I would just drop scape.
Well, I think we really need a separate set of conference only about the nomenclature, right? So so for example, like in Japan and Korea and China, we have all this like a long discussion about if the translation of landscape architecture into their own language is correct or not, because in those countries we all feel that the translation of landscape architecture into Korean, Japanese, Chinese are really limiting our scope of work in all different regions, because three countries share the same word, 산수, which is mountain and water, literally translated. But then, like for example, like Kong Ji-Yu's criticism about the word 산수 is that between 산 and 수, which is between mountain and water, it misses human, like a field, where the labors are happening. So that's the criticism. Why he believes the Chinese traditional garden was all about like a higher class people's luxurious the hobby, rather than really working for the general citizens' everyday life. So he kind of started his way of landscape practice by negating the traditional Chinese landscape practice, as far as I understood. So this the problem of making nomenclature is a really important start point of profession. So I think while we have this another conference about naming of it, I think we should just keep the landscape architecture for now. And then maybe each country should come up with their own translation that really that is really kind of extracted from their own culture. I think, for example, like that translation engineer that is specialized in green space, maybe that's perfect for their own history and context. I don't know, but there got to be a reason why they came up with this translation. For Japan, for example, they also gave up translating landscape architecture into Japanese. So they used this landscape architecto in katakana, just literally spelling out, just transcription of the English pronunciation. So, so what I'm trying to say is that the naming is really important step to begin with, but then each name should be really diluted from their own history and culture, I think.
I'm going to answer this in a very quick way. There is no word, even in Yoruba, for architecture. Where do we start when we have to then take it to landscape architecture? I mean, these are professions that did not exist in tradition. Nobody sat and drew a house or decided to do landscaping. So I have no answer to that question. But I would like to address the question that the lady asked about this idea of cities and equity, and the structural challenges that exist with how we live today. I think, honestly, if we look at human population increase, and if we look at city development, whether we like it or not, this trajectory is the trajectory that we're going on. The world is converging into cities. That's not going to change. What we do need is more equity, because the economic system that has gotten us here is actually what has created all the disparity. If we don't have advocacy, where people actually speak about how we can use design, then nothing ever will happen. There are so many other things that influence it. There's policy, there's the economic situations, and yes, as designers, landscape architects or architects, we don't control those things, but within our realm, like some of the projects that we've seen in this conference that consciously use their skills to create positive solutions, I think that's not a bad thing. It's not the overall solution, but if we don't do that, then what do we do? Yeah.
Let me have the word. Since I've been made to understand now that an architect is somebody who put things together. So I have handed that now. At least I've put this together. So I'm an architect. But I think that question, Garrett himself has provided us a way out. In your book, your good book, Landscape Is, right? You made a line there that I find very, interesting, and you said, landscape. I'm just paraphrasing now. Landscape is underscored by the promiscuous identities, and that really makes it very difficult to have just a singular, naming or conception, from one place to another. And I think that opens up the debate for continuous engagement.
On that note, we will reconvene in 10 minutes. Thank you so much to all of you.